My name is Ivo Welch. I come from a little town named Schweinfurt. We were the only Jews in an environment of about 150,000 people. My father was a concentration camp survivor, and after the war, he was from Poland originally, went to the United States for 5 years, came back to Germany, and of course, because he had no education, he survived Auschwitz, had to become an entrepreneur. So for the most part, we had no academic background in my family. My mother comes from a family of 7 children. Her parents are both deaf mutes, so she was a child of deaf adults, just like the Oscar movie at the moment, and had no parental supervision either. My parents managed to scrape together a good living. We actually owned discotheques and nightclubs. Well, they owned discotheques and nightclubs, and took very good care of us. Of course, my father was relatively strict. He was born in 1923, and whatever I think I may accomplish in my life will never get close to what he accomplished in his life. He may not have any academic education, but he managed to maintain being a human being throughout his entire concentration camp experience. In fact, it was very common for people who would meet him on the street to ask, for example, his brother when he was with him, who's the person next to you? And would say, well, this is my brother Aaron. And Aaron Wilczkowski, oh, you saved my family in this and this circumstance. One of the stories of my father is he was very short. He was 1.60 meters tall. And when the Germans evacuated the Lodz ghetto, he had the choice of staying there because he was an auxiliary policeman who helped. But because his mother and sister were evacuated, he decided to go with them. And he had a pretty good idea that that was not good news. And he was in this cattle car with like 80 people that were all fit into this very, very tight space. I think it was 80, some very high number. And usually what happened, they were so tight from one another, some people would suffocate. And there were these breathing holes, and usually a bully or two would occupy the area next to the breathing hole, and the people in the back would not get oxygen and die. So what he decided to do was, I'm going to cure this. He's 1.60 meters tall. He would go right next to them, wait until the first person fell asleep, and hit them over the head with a stone. They would wake up and would scream, who in the world was this, whatever, but it's dark, there are many people, there's not much that they can do. They would fall asleep again, he would do the same thing again. They relinquished the air hole. And what my father did afterwards is he actually had people circulate in the cattle car so that everybody would get oxygen for a while, so that nobody would suffocate. And he said when he came to Auschwitz, they opened the cattle car, the SS men came by and they said, where are the dead people of this cattle car? They'd never seen a cattle car without any dead people. So my father managed to do that, save everybody. Typically when there was things to be divided, food, other things, my father was the one that everybody trusted. He really had a very good sense of fairness, and he remained a human being, a mensch. So he was, in that case, a absolutely lovely human being. He also managed to have quite a temper, so even though he was only 1.60 meters tall, everybody was afraid of him. He had natural authority, natural charisma. And I wish I had inherited more of this. I guess I haven't. Certainly not as intimidating as my father is, even though I'm quite a bit taller. But that was sort of the upbringing. We were a very tight family. As I said, we were the only Jewish family. I had many wonderful German friends. Still consider them wonderful. My mother also is German-born, was not Jewish. And it was a great upbringing, but not one where you would be academically very ambitious. So that is something that just randomly developed afterwards. I actually fell into my life one by one. My father wanted me to study in the United States because he had seen that before the war, lots of the Jews that knew it was bad news, what was coming, refused to leave Poland because they thought that they could just wait it out. They had all their businesses there, all their lives there. They had never lived anywhere else. My father wanted me to have an experience somewhere else. So he said that he would pay for education for me wherever I wanted to go. And so as a precocious 16 or 17-year-old, I decided I was going to conquer the world and go to the United States. Of course, as an arrogant but insecure 17-year-old, I opened my mouth a little bit too loudly, and I said I was going to conquer the world because once I arrived at Columbia University and I saw how terrible my dorm room was, I probably would have been on the next flight back home if I had not opened my mouth so loud to all my friends that I was going to conquer the world. However, now I was stuck there, and it took me a few months, but eventually I learned that the state of where I actually lived in was secondary to all the wonderful things that I experienced at Columbia, all the wonderful friends that I've made, all the wonderful teachers that I've had. I had the greatest time of my life at Columbia University. But when you can hear the roaches run around in your room as soon as you turn the light off, there are definitely some limits to that joy as well. And I studied there for 3 years. Then I decided I needed to get more of a graduate degree for name because I wanted to go back to Germany and become an entrepreneur. And in Germany, having an academic title is the equivalent of being the new aristocracy. I'm not going to be a von Welch, so the closest that I can be is a Dr. Welch or an MBA Welch. So I applied to MBA programs, but they told me that I was too young and needed work experience. And frankly, I didn't want to work carrying water for somebody else. So I decided it would be nice to have a doctor title, and I applied for a PhD without having any idea of what I was going to get myself into. Of course, at Columbia, I was still always at the top of my class without trying. I get to Chicago, where I eventually got my PhD. And all of a sudden, I'm in the middle of my class, or actually in the bottom third of my class. All the other students have experience in economics. Some have master's degree. Eugene Kandel, who you know quite well, had a master's degree before. And I find myself in this environment, and suddenly I have to learn how to survive. And I was not the top student anymore, and it was a very humbling experience. But it was also a wonderful experience, and I learned a lot. And when it came to solving new problems, this was where I shone. So I could figure out eventually how to find new problems and find interesting answers to them. That's how I eventually fell into writing a PhD thesis. And then suddenly I realized maybe academia is not such a bad profession after all, and maybe I don't need to go back to Germany in order to become an entrepreneur. Maybe I want to try this academia thing. I got an offer from UCLA. Within a year, I had written my now most famous paper on informational cascades. In a sense, academia was very easy for me. I never had to struggle very much. I also, for that reason, never had to try out very many different things. I just fell into it, and it worked for me from day one. And I see many of my other colleagues who had to struggle initially to get their papers published, to have a record that was tenurable. For me, luckily, this came very easily. I got tenure based probably primarily on my informational cascades paper, and have been writing other papers ever since. And it worked well. It has been fun. It is incredibly intellectually rewarding. I meet young people, I meet new people, I meet interesting people. I have fun, interesting colleagues. I have the luxury of saying no when I consider something unethical. I am not out to make a whole lot of money. I can live very comfortably on the salary that I earn from UCLA. And it's a fantastic job. It's a fantastic career. It can be miserable for somebody if your papers do not get published. For me, it was just very, very lucky, and I'm very blessed, and I'm very grateful that it happened. And I don't take it for granted. Life has been really wonderful to me. So let me tell you about my most influential paper first before I tell you how I got to it. I always tell people it's sort of funny that I am known as an economist for something that your grandmother could tell you. And the example that I usually use is the following. Let's say we go to a city with 2 Chinese restaurants, one on the left, one on the right. None of us has ever been there. And let's presume that we are all thinking that we have an opinion, which one is better, the left or the right restaurant. But it's just an opinion, it's not perfect knowledge. And let's say that I see you going to the right restaurant. That lets me infer that you think the right restaurant is better than the left restaurant. Let's presume there's another person who also goes to figure out which restaurant to pick, and they also go to the right restaurant. Well, that probably means they also thought the right restaurant was better than the left restaurant, or they would have gone to the left restaurant. Now consider my decision problem. Let's presume I think the left restaurant is better than the right restaurant. If I think that your information or your opinion is as valid as mine, none of us have a great idea, but whatever it is, we are about equally informed. I can just count up pieces of information. I have 2 people that say right is better and 1 person that says left is better. So I'm going to go to the right restaurant as well, even though I think the left restaurant is better. So will everybody else behind me. They're going to recognize that I didn't choose the right restaurant necessarily because I thought the right restaurant was better, but they're going to be in the same position as I am. So everybody will end up going to the right restaurant based just on the information of the first 2 people. It's sort of interesting that when I tell this story, lots of people will say, of course, that's natural. But yes, this is sadly or luckily what I'm most well known for. It's just a very, very simple insight that once I explain it to you, you can understand it. You don't have to be a trained economist. I can explain it to everybody. So it turns out that nothing in my life came from a grand strategic plan. It's mostly serendipitous. I happen to play around with a particular model, with a particular idea. I read something and I decide that I want to write a paper about this. Informational cascades came about because I was sitting in my office and I was trying to play with a model of how investors would buy shares in IPOs. And I had this wonderful idea that was exactly informational cascades, where if the first 2 investors buy, it will all of a sudden be in the interest of the next investor to buy as well. And I was really excited. I remember this like today, that it was 11 o'clock at night and my office neighbor was David Hirschleifer. And I went to him and I said, I have this great theory why everybody will always buy when the other people buy, and therefore the price of an IPO will go up. But it hadn't occurred to me at that moment that it also goes the other way, that if the price actually goes down and the first 2 people do not buy, that nobody else will buy after either. That I discovered the following day. So I'm still laughing to this date about how I first discovered a positive cascade and then a negative cascade the following day. All the other stuff, all the other applications, the idea that it applies to dating, that it applies to biology, that it applies to many other things came later. And I have to say that my co-authors, Sushil Bikhchandani and David Hirschleifer, played a really great role in clarifying a lot of those things, coming up with a lot of great examples, in helping me generalize what was originally a very straightforward IPO story into the broader venue. So I think that it was wonderful for them, and I think it was wonderful for me, that we worked together on the subject for the second paper. And the second paper is far more famous than the first paper. First paper is well cited, but it's really the second paper that was the generic breakthrough. I hope it doesn't sound immodest to say that it's probably one of the most recent major economic theory insights. So we had many, many before. We had signaling, we had auctions, we had principal-agent problems, we had many other problems that are wonderful theoretical breakthroughs. But in terms of a simple major idea, I would think that there aren't very many that can compete with informational cascades in the last 30 years, and it's now been about 30 years since we've written that paper. Economists use mathematics as a language to communicate ideas. it helps you make sure that what you think is logical truly is logical. So there's definitely a reason why we're doing this. However, this idea is so simple that you wouldn't really need a lot of math to explain this. You could write this as a philosophical paper. You don't need to have a mathematical theory. I don't think it's really essential that it's coded in math. I think it's just a way of communicating the idea. Math is a tool for me. It is not a purpose in itself. That makes me somewhat different from many other economists for whom the tools are purposes in themselves. They want to develop the tools for others to use. I am not an economist like that. I'm mostly driven by particular problems, finding answers, and then finding the best tools to express this. Many times referees and editors will be somewhat dismayed by how low level and how conversational I write my papers. But that is intentional because my ideas typically tend to be very simple, and the highest praise that you can give any of my papers is that they feel like Columbus' egg. Once I tell you, it seems totally natural, and you wonder why it wasn't obvious before, you wonder why other people haven't found it. And probably in many of them, sometimes other people have found the same idea. It just died in the literature, it was expressed in too complex a way. I always give credit when I find somebody else doing something before. Typically, I just invent my own wheel or I reinvent the wheel, I don't know. But I try to make things really simple and really obvious and to describe with as few tools and mathematical sophistication as possible. I am trying to teach my students how to fish. I don't want to give them a fish. I want to give them a way of thinking. I want to give them a way of approaching new problems. And sometimes this is difficult to do, especially for our PhD students, because they are trained to regurgitate mathematics and to regurgitate examples that have already been solved, that have been simplified. And many of them get very good at that, but can't solve any new problems. And so one of my biggest challenges in teaching has always been, how do I get people to use their common sense and think about the problems rather than thinking about just studying solutions? And I think that goes through all my teaching, whether I teach my children in high school, whether I teach college students, whether I teach MBA students or PhD students, or whether I give a seminar to other faculty. The way that I express ideas is very different. Sometimes, of course, I give a seminar and I assume there's certain econometric knowledge in the room or economic knowledge that I don't have to explain. But typically, I could take any presentation that I take in an academic seminar and teach that to a high school class. Maybe not the bottom half, but certainly if any of the students can understand physics and can be sitting in a physics class, I can explain to them the economic ideas that I'm trying to convey. And if you read my textbook, for example, I think you will very strongly hear my voice in them. In fact, everybody who reads my textbook says, when I read your sentences, I can hear you talk. And I talk to my audience the same way that I talk to my kids, the same way I talk to you, whether you're listening now on the internet or whether it's you sitting across from me. I don't make many distinctions, many differences between them. I think the ideas are fairly simple. When ideas become very, very complex, you wonder whether they are really valid ideas or whether they are contortions that may be intellectually true, but may not really have much relevance in the real world. Now, I shouldn't say anything bad about one subject that is very common, that is called Bayesian persuasion, and that is very important in the literature. And the people, actually it's multiple people, who invented this are extremely clever. They're great economists. They won all the economists' medals, all the awards that you can possibly get for this. And justly so. But if you ask me Bayesian persuasion, which basically says that I disclose to you kind of information that will nudge you in a particular direction that I want to. If I really try and find applications of that in the real world, I'm hard-pressed to find any that I find halfway believable. Usually, if I hide information from you, the first thing that you will ask me, why are you not telling me this? And in Bayesian persuasion, that is not an option. You basically commit to this. It's a great story, it's a clever story, but when I look at real-world applications, it's very hard to find convincing ones. There are some, but it's hard. My stories, what I try and communicate is usually much simpler. It's why I like this kind of stuff. It's what I like to convey to other people. And if I manage to convey that, and I manage to get people to think for themselves about interesting problems and interesting solutions and how you approach that best, and how you go about approaching a whole new problems, then I've done my job. That's all I want to do. I would not want every economist to be like me, but I think it's good to have some economists like me. I like diversity in all respects in terms of having different friends, different people, different ways of approaching research, different interested areas and perceptions. And I've worked together with wonderful economists that are much smarter than I am, and that have brought great things to joint papers that we have written together. And it's been great. And I've benefited really from that. And I wouldn't want them to be carbon copies of me. That would not be useful. It's really great if you have different people with different opinions. I think what got me started on writing my textbook was that most of the existing textbooks at the time primarily gave you fish, rather than teaching you how to fish. And so what I wanted to do primarily was to show people why it is that we've come to these particular formulas and to these particular solutions. Until I wrote my book, and maybe still to this day, it is the opinion of many finance professors that what we want is to make the students feel like they are managers. They are up there at 30,000 feet, they are overlooking the world, and they are making these grand decisions about strategy and other things. And a book should convey to them that they are the masters of the universe. And I think that is the wrong approach. I think that our students, when they graduate, will be carrying the water for many years to come. They will not be the CEO to take over grand strategy at Apple or IBM or Google. They will basically work their ways up. And what they should have is a set of tools and a set of understandings that allows them to take whatever I teach them and apply that to new problems that they have. And I didn't see such a textbook out there. That's the reason why I decided we really needed to write a textbook. And because nobody else was writing this, I ended up drafting chapters, and I didn't decide to write a textbook right from start. That sort of came in stages. It also made me realize that even I, having studied finance for 15 years, there were many simple topics where I had just adopted the formulas of other people, and I think they were the wrong formulas. I either didn't know how to apply them, that was the case in some cases, or they were just outright not suitable for the job. So people were teaching things that came out of academic papers that were totally unnecessary and misleading and irrelevant from the student's perspective. And so while writing new chapters, I actually learned a lot myself. Sort of is silly. I have taught finance for 15 years. I've been in the profession for close to 20 years, and I'm still learning from writing an introductory finance textbook. That's how I ended up writing my textbook. It came in stages. One by one, I learned a lot from this. I have a much better view of the basic problems of finance now. It helped me organize my own knowledge. It helped me think about what I think is important and what is not important. And that's how the book came about. I don't think there is that much difference between a high school student who is self-studying and a PhD student who is in their third year of finance. having studied this for many, many years in terms of how to understand and approach new problems. I think the ideas, the basic ideas, are all very simple. And I tell all of my PhD students, even those that are really good at math and they can solve all the differential equations you can throw at them in the world, even them I tell, please go back, read the basic examples in the book and get an overall idea of what the logic of all this is in finance. A high school student who can deal with physics, who can take a physics class or a chemistry class, surely could pick up my book and learn finance just as well. It's not harder than that. There are some people for whom this is probably not a great subject, but those people wouldn't enjoy physics either. So for the set of people that can do basic calculus, can do a basic physics course just with algebra, not even with calculus, those kinds of people can also read my finance book and understand basic finance. I also value very much, I've taken everything self-contained, so you don't need to have a statistics background. I try to teach the statistics in the book itself. Everything that you know about statistics is in the book. The accounting background, everything that you need to know about accounting is in the book. This doesn't mean that a statistics or an accounting course isn't a great thing also to take and learn more and understand more. And if you see material the second or third time, it's much more obvious because you know how it will all come together. Even if you don't understand it the first time, just letting through osmosis get into you, reading it without fully understanding it. The second time you read it, you will know where it's going and it will make much more sense. So yes, I think everybody that has a healthy intellectual interest can pick up my textbook and learn finance the same way that MBA or PhD students can learn it. What will they come away with? I think they should come away with the same kind of joy that you get when you understand some basic physics phenomena, when you understand how billiard balls move around and that there's actually laws governing them, when you understand the laws of gravity, when you will understand how a rocket actually works, when you understand how salt can come about from two toxic elements. It's this wonderful thing about scientific discovery. It's interesting in itself. The meaning of life is, of course, a very, very broad question, and different people have different takes on that. For some, it's religious. For me, it's this very interesting aspect to learn more about what's going on in the world around me. And I love to read science sites, and I love to find out more about new technologies, about CRISPR-Cas9, about mRNA techniques, about all sorts of other novel things. They don't have to be in my particular area. So I would hope that a student comes back with the same appreciation that this is a really fascinating subject. It's not the only subject. There's many other subjects that are also very interesting that one could study. Material sciences are fascinating. Batteries, energy storage technology is fascinating. There's lots of fascinating things. Finance is one of those things that are fascinating that I would want to learn about. Marketing, psychology, organizational behavior. There's so many things that are wonderful. Unfortunately, I cannot learn all of them in one lifetime. If I could, I would. So if you ask me what students will come away with, it's just some jewels of learning and experience and science that they didn't know before. I hope it will open some of their eyes, give them new venues, and that's the point of it. And for me, this is a goal and interest in themselves. If you're only doing it because you want to become rich, I don't know, maybe it will make you rich, but that's not my goal. My goal is to convey the wonders of science, the wonders of social science to the students that read my book. Anybody who thinks that writing a textbook is great fun and lucrative and will make them rich, I think is mistaken. It's a little bit like the star system in Hollywood. There may be one or two textbooks that can make people really wealthy, but most people who write textbooks should do it for the fun and joy of putting together their view of the world for the students and changing the students' point of view and giving them their take on a particular subject. So I didn't write it primarily because I wanted to make money. I make enough money. Yes, money is a nice thing. I wouldn't mind more money, but that was not the point. The point was really to convey all the wonderful ideas of economics and finance to my students and have a venue of doing it myself. This is also why the textbook is single-authored. So when I decide that something is important, I don't need to check with 3 other people whether they agree with this and whether this helps the sales or hurts the sales. I am not concerned with this. If I think a subject matter is really important, it's going to be in this book, and I will put it in. I, for example, discuss in my book a little bit about causation versus correlation. That's not necessary in finance. It's one of the great innovations in microeconomics for the last 20 years. And there was just a few Nobel Prizes on that. But I thought that idea was so powerful and so useful that I could not let my students get away with having had a financial economics textbook and never having seen that idea. And so I wrote a little bit of that. Now, if you ask a publisher, should we put this in? The only question they're going to have is, well, will that get more other instructors to assign the textbook? And for me, that's not the primary question. For me, the primary question is this something that the students will take away that they will find really useful and interesting and fascinating? This is the reason why it's in my textbook. I chose a 0 price for my textbook because my goal and intent is to convey the ideas and information to as many students as possible. I do not need to earn money from that. If I wanted to earn money, there's a lot of other things that I could do. It's almost silly for me to try and make money off of my textbook when all I want is to convey the ideas. The reason why other textbooks really cost $200 to $300 a book is because there's a whole machinery of the publisher that's making the graphs more colorful, that finds ways to talk instructors into buying the textbook. Actually, the instructors don't buy the textbook. What they try and do is for the instructors to tell the students they have to pay for the textbook. And the instructors don't pay for the textbooks themselves. So it's a wonderful racket for the publishers. And I am not in this racket. Almost every economic paper that I write, not just my textbook, are based on a simple numerical example where I see that something makes sense. When I said earlier that math is a tool, it's a tool that makes sure that your logic is correct. There are many faculty who can think in algebra. And for really simple algebra equations, I can still do that too. But I find it much more intuitive to actually work a specific example. So if I have one numerical example where I know a particular argument works, the rest is just algebraic generalization. I wouldn't say a monkey can do it, but it's not very hard to do it. Once you have an example, putting it into algebra is easy. So I always urge anybody, whether they are writing a PhD thesis or an academic paper, show it to me in a nice, simple numerical example. And if you can do that, I believe you. And if you cannot do that, chances are that what you have written down is wrong. And that even applies to some people who should have won the Nobel Prize. I had an argument with Steve Ross, who of course is a very famous finance professor, who died much too young. He was a scholar and a gentleman and one of my favorite people of all time. And he wrote many stellar papers, but his last paper, where he tried to extract utility functions from options, turns out to be wrong. And I know this because I tried to pin him down 10 times on a numerical example, and he could not manage to produce a numerical example. And after he died, I asked one of my friends who works in the same area, I explained to him, I tried to ask Steve many, many times, please explain it to me, and he couldn't. And my colleague, without hesitation, said, yeah, that's because it was wrong and you can't come up with a numerical example. If you cannot put it into a numerical example, chances are your theory is wrong. Try a numerical example. It's the simplest way to think about an argument. When you have to produce a solution to a problem, get it as simple as possible with specific numbers and see whether you can solve it. And that's the easiest way to approach problems. It's the easiest way for me. It's the easiest way for probably 99% of all students, people in general. This is why I try to teach it in my book. And hopefully this is one of the methods that the students take away from the book. If you have a new problem, make a simple numerical example, try and figure it out with that. You have $100, this person gets X dollars, $5, this person gets $10. Put it together, tell me what happens next. And usually this fairly quickly will get them to understand what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. So I started off thinking that perhaps my perspective was a little bit too narrow. Perhaps finance wasn't everything. And I started thinking about what are the most defining problems of our time. And I came to the conclusion that probably one of them is climate change. And I must admit, when I started writing my textbook, my new book, it's not clear whether it's a textbook or a general book, I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. Sort of similar to how I got myself into the PhD program. I didn't know what I was getting myself into. But I decided I was going to go out and try and learn what is interesting about the subject matter. And it turns out that I now have a far more nuanced view of climate change. So it is clearly one of the most important things that is happening in our lifetimes. But much of what is written in the media is wrong. Much of the perspective that you get from either climate activists or fossil fuel shills, of which there are quite a lot, is wrong. Turns out that the truth is much more complicated. So we spent the first 5 chapters writing on the atmospheric sciences, and I am now emailing with various science professors that are telling me, you got this wrong, this is right, this is wrong, this is right. And even now, after having taught it for 2 years, having written the first draft of my book, I'm still learning things that are wrong. And I am very happy to correct this because I only have one goal: to get the science as objective and correct as possible. I am not trying to convey my own point of view. I'm trying to describe different points of view when they are valid, when they exist. I'm trying to be as honest as I possibly can. So just to give you the very basics, climate change is real. We are going to have about 3 degrees centigrade increase over pre-industrial times. And it's going to dramatically change the world as we live in it. However, the world has already changed quite dramatically over the last 10 to 12,000 years of human existence. Well, we've existed about 200,000 years, 10 to 12,000 years of human history, roughly. The civilization that we inhabit basically developed in the last 4,000 years. Those 4,000 years have been the most stable times in terms of climate in the history of humanity, and certainly for a very, very long time. Temperature variability was very mild. In the last 12,000 years, temperatures have increased by 6 degrees centigrade. So when people write that the world will come to an end from the 3 degrees centigrade, they are trying to paint a picture that is just false. Yes, it is true that the world will change, but it will not come to an end. And in fact, for many people, it will barely make a difference. It will make more of a difference for many poor people. It will make a difference, particularly in places like Bangladesh, which are very close to sea level, where 20%, I think it's 20%, of the population may lose access to the land that they're currently farming. But then again, if you ask yourself, what is the big problem of Bangladesh? It's not necessarily the fact that in 50 to 100 years, seawater will be about 1.5 feet higher, which is the general forecast. It is probably more that There's already 20, 30, 40 million people in Bangladesh today which are living at absolute subsistence, which have no resources, which therefore cannot easily move. There's many other problems to be addressed that relate to poverty that we're not addressing. And frankly, it's the great shame of society overall that we're not addressing that. Climate change is a challenge. It matters. It will change. It will make many people worse off, but it will not bring the end of the world. In fact, if we do everything that countries have promised, everything that we can do, we will lower global warming from about 3 degrees centigrade to about 2.7 degrees centigrade. So what we're talking about is if we really are willing to endure great recessions, great suffering, we will manage to push down warming from 3 degrees centigrade to 2.7 degrees centigrade. Could that make all the difference? Yes, it could. There could be tipping points. There could be all sorts of bad things that might happen, and that 0.3 degree could make all the difference. Is it likely that it will make all the difference? No, it's not. And we have many other problems that we have to deal with at the same time. Another thing that I had not appreciated is that about only 1/3 of all emissions now come from the OECD countries. 2/3 come from non-OECD countries. So even if we manage to completely remove all the OECD country emissions, we manage to wipe Europe and the United States off the map. Within about one generation, total world emissions would be at the same level that they are today. 2/3 of all global emissions are already from non-OECD countries, and it will be 3/4. China has stabilized at a very high level. They have now more emissions than Europeans. India is coming on strong. They are going to have far more emissions. And unfortunately, Africa is not going to have very high emissions because the people there are growing at the fastest rate on the planet. They're going to add 3 billion people within 2 generations. But most of Africa lives in utter poverty. And the reason why they emit so little is because they live in utter poverty. One cannot commiserate with them. I don't know how to say this, but it's really terrible that they don't have a better lifestyle. So if you want to do anything about global warming, you cannot do that by tightening the belt in rich countries. The math does not add up. This is not possible to do. What you need to do is you need to make it in the interest of everybody, OECD and non-OECD countries, to want to move to clean energy. And clean energy is almost a solved problem. So today, we can generate electricity cheaper with photovoltaic cells and windmills than we can with fossil fuels. The problem is we can only generate electricity when nature wants us to generate electricity. And the real problem is, what do we do when the sun has gone down and the wind is not blowing? The real unsolved problem is energy storage. So order of magnitude, it costs about $80 a megawatt hour for electricity from fossil fuels. It's a little bit less for natural gas, where it can be 50, 60. It's a little bit more for coal if it has to be schlepped further. But this is the order of magnitude that we're talking about. We can already generate clean electricity for about $40 to $50 per megawatt hour. Photovoltaic is forecast within 30 years to go below $20 a megawatt hour. Human civilization has never had power that cheap. The problem is, once we have to take that megawatt hour and store it for later release, we have to pay another $200 per megawatt hour. So unless we can figure out how to solve the energy storage problem, we cannot drive our economy with clean energy. But I'm really optimistic that that is a problem that can be solved. So if we want to solve global warming and pollution, and fossil fuels kill a lot of people, even without global warming. Their emissions are terrible. The soot, the PM particles, is a nightmare. If we want to get rid of fossil fuels, we'll need to find a way to make clean energy storage cheaper. And we can do this. We can subsidize clean energy storage research. There are many ideas that are currently being pursued. I'm really optimistic that we can do that. And that's a much smarter and much cheaper way to go about it than to try and restrict fossil fuel emissions in countries that really want to use them because they are the cheapest source. That's just not going to work. India is not going to say, oh, for the sake of the world, we have to reduce our fossil fuel consumptions. Their problem is they have a few 100 million people living in poverty. That's what they want to take care of. We have to make it in the interest of the Indian leader to want to deploy clean energy rather than fossil fuels. And we're almost there. We can get there. One of the things that tenure gives you is this ability to express unpopular opinions. That is the idea that you can offend people and not worry about your job. Now, it is true that it hasn't particularly helped my career many times to express unpopular opinions or to point out errors in other people's work. However, I have been so blessed by being in the position that I am, that I can be honest about what I think is right, that I feel it's my duty, my obligation to just be honest. My climate textbook almost surely will be hated by people on every side, by both the fossil fuel shills and the environmental activists. It's trying to be brutally honest. I am not trying to color things. I'm not trying to mention anything or suppress anything that isn't suitable. There's one shtick that our book emphasizes that other people don't emphasize. And it's not that they haven't recognized it, but they have not put it to the front and center. We believe in our book on climate change that people and countries do things that are in their own self-interest. They are selfish. And this idea that we can have the United Nations somehow have a climate treaty that solves the problem and will magically make countries decide to forego their own self-interest just isn't going to happen in our opinion. I wish I was wrong. I wish countries were more altruistic, but I don't think it's going to happen. So the one thing that our book is really quite specific about is if you take into account that most people are self-interested, what can you do given what you have? And that is really the strongest perspective that we put forth in our book. In terms of the Critical Finance Review, which is the journal that I'm editing, it is clear that it has not made me many friends. But I was really concerned that we were publishing papers that clearly were wrong and were never corrected, and that outsiders who read those papers would come to the conclusion that we are not a serious profession, that we are not serious science, that we don't have serious skepticism, and that we are just being polite and just not do what we are supposed to do, which is to ask hard questions and be hard-hitting. We sometimes have accusations that we in economics are more aggressive than the people in the other social sciences. And that is probably true, we are. But when push comes to shove and you really have to write down on a piece of paper, this paper that somebody else has written is wrong, few people actually have the chutzpah to do that. They're afraid that the original authors will hate them for it, which may be true, especially if it becomes personal, and it should never become personal. This is one of the things that I think is really important. My authors are allowed to critique a paper. They are not allowed to question the intentions of the original authors. I am really eager that we discuss work, that we are skeptical about that we are hard-hitting. And if this is less polite, it has to be so for the sake of science. I am very sorry if there are some groups that would prefer a more polite and a less aggressive approach. I believe science by nature has to be skeptical. When somebody says something, you want to doubt it. This is not religion, this is not belief, this is not polite conversation, in which case you don't want to offend anybody. This is science. You do want to offend other people. You do want to overthrow old theories. You want to tell old people like me, and I'm old at this point, that what they have written is wrong. And clearly, I will not be very happy when somebody writes that about me, although I hope that I will be more open-minded when it will happen to me. And they should write this. This is what science should be all about. I hope they will not make it personal, but if they think a paper of mine is wrong, they should write that a paper of mine is wrong. And they should say so in a seminar if they think that is wrong. And they should try and do so in the most polite way possible, but also in a very direct way that leaves no doubt that what I would have written was wrong. And that's where I hope to have pushed the profession, the economics profession, to. And when I talk to my colleagues in many other places and many other universities, it is very common that they say that we have changed the profession with a critical finance review. People now think much more about what it is that they publish, and they find it much more interesting. And sometimes there is no right answer. Sometimes there are different perspectives. And they learn both sides, and that's what the journal is trying to do. I have been very lucky in my life that I have worked on many different subject areas. I'm not an expert on anything really. I've brought my own point of view to many different subject areas. Many of them have been quite successful, perhaps because I was not part of the area. So I never really learned to become an egghead that pursues only one particular subject area. And maybe that is a lesson I should have learned earlier. I never learned it, and now I'm too old to learn new tricks. So I decided at some point, after having many interesting dinner conversations with a colleague of mine, Glenn Lowry from Brown University, that the US penal justice system is very inefficient and very unfair. This is particularly the case for minorities. Glenn actually himself had some personal experiences in the prison system. He learned a lot, he changed a lot of his opinions, and has done excellent research on the economics of our penal system. And it is clear that it is now exists primarily for the sake of an industrial prison complex and for riling up particular parts of the population during political campaigns, rather than for achieving justice. And as a result, there are now many people that are in prison for many, many years that shouldn't be in prison. Now, I'm not a diehard liberal. I'm actually for the death penalty. I am against the death penalty, how it is administered at the moment. It is completely unfairly administered. It is almost arbitrary. It is blatantly discriminatory against minorities. But there are cases where I think the death penalty should be available. Rare cases, but there are some. Not how it's done today. And so over one of the many conversations that I had with Glenn, I listened to what Glenn was writing in various academic journals and in some other outlets. And I came to the conclusion that the only way we can change the system is if it becomes in the interest of politicians to reduce tough sentences and have more just sentences. And when I moved back to Los Angeles, I realized that I'm really quite close to the Hollywood movie industry, where there's a lot of TV productions, where there's a lot of movie productions. And I'm thinking to myself, what can I do to make the world a better place? And this would seem a great way to actually make the world a better place and actually make something interesting. Would it be nice if it made some money? Yes, it would be nice too, but that's not what's driving me. What's driving me is just this idea of producing something interesting that people will enjoy watching, that will make them become more understanding, that will make them become more sane, that will make our prison system more just, that will make our sentencing more fair, that will make it in the interest of politicians not to ratchet up the penalties for individual crimes. And there are so many of them that are just terrible. Now, I'm not trying to have an innocence project here. This is not about people that are innocently in jail. Well, I, of course, would love to help people that are innocent and get them out of jail, but we already have an Innocence Project that does this, and they're doing God's work. They're doing wonderful things. For everyone who is innocently convicted, there are probably 10 people in prisons today that no longer have to be in prisons, that are no threat to society, where we pay $100,000 a year or more to keep them incarcerated, where nothing is to be gained by keeping them in prison, where even the victims say at some point, okay, this person has committed a crime, but after 1 or 2 years in prison, that's enough. They don't have to be in prison for 10 years. We have crimes here in this country that don't exist in other places like Europe. My favorite is felony murder, where if you happen to drive your friend to a 7-Eleven where you think that the friend is going to steal some beer cans, commit a crime, you don't go inside, your friend goes in, shoots somebody, which you didn't know, kills that person, comes out and you drive them away, you are guilty of murder in the United States. I cannot understand how such a person is guilty of murder. Is he innocent or she innocent? No, absolutely not. They were complicit in a crime. They deserve going to prison for some time, but not for 10 or 20 years. There is a reasonable amount that you can do so. We had a 3 strikes and you're outlaw, which is just insane in some circumstances. Not in all circumstances. We need to have a saner sentencing regime. We need to have better penalties, and that's the reason why I got involved with this. I had a couple of people from the film industry that have told me that this is a great show, a great idea, but when push really comes to shove, everyone has a different idea, everyone wants to do something slightly different, and I've come to the conclusion that the only way that one can actually pull this off is to produce a pilot episode that will really pull in the audience and will show how interesting such a series can get, and then sell it to Netflix, Amazon, Oprah's W channel, Apple, some channel like this. And it could be a wonderful boon for a lot of young people. It could be positive. It would make the world a better place, unlike many of the prisons and cops shows that were given out in the past on TV, where most of it was all about the dark side, about the worst criminals that we want to lock up, and how the police is protecting us. And yes, the police is protecting us. But here we can do something that's really in everybody's interest, and that we can pull off, and that will be fun and fascinating to watch. And I am trying to see whether we can pull this off. I don't know. It will depend on having somebody with the right background, really making this their primary project. Frankly, I want to be the chairman of the board. I'm not going to be the CEO of this venture. I want to sit on the board of this venture. I want to make it help come true, but I'm not going to be the driving person. I'm not in the film industry. So if we can pull this off, we could combine the best of all worlds. We can bring in people like Glenn Lowry. We can interview people in prisons. We can interview victims. We can talk to people that are in charge of the way that sentences get ratcheted up in the political system. We can do a lot of fascinating things. We can have a lot more impact, perhaps, than most of my academic work ever will. I want to do interesting things in life. I have about, 20, 30 good years left on this earth, and I want to do things that I find interesting and rewarding, and that leave the world a better place. I live a blessed life, and I hope my kids, which I'm very blessed with, and my wife are going to have a good life, and this is my objective. It's not to maximize profit, it's not to maximize revenue. I want to help my students become better. At this point, I'm happier if I see my PhD students write a good paper than myself writing a good paper, because I want to see them have success. There's a joy in this. There's a stage in one's life where one tries to have success himself or herself. So clearly, when I was 30 years old, I didn't have the same objective function that I had today. I had an academic career ahead of me, and I was really interested in advancing that, in publishing great papers. And I still want to publish great papers, and I still want to publish honest papers. But now a big part of my objective function is to help other people. And that's the goal here. One of the things that I did was also at Brown when I talked to Glenn Lowry. There was an inner city high school called Hope High School, which was very close to Brown University, which at some point was a great school for the people that lived in the neighborhood. Then they started busing. And the problem was when they started to bus too much, all the white students and neighborhood students from that school left, and it became the poorest performing school in the entire Providence school system. So what I did is I happened to meet somebody at a party who worked for the Rhode Island School of Education, and he said he knew the principal over at Hope High. And so he and I marched over to meet the principal, and we asked him, what is it that we can do at Hope High School that would motivate the student? And he said, we brainstormed for a while, and he said, well, to most of the students here, Brown University, which is literally just 3 blocks away from you, to them is like the Chinese emperor's palace. They cannot see themselves in there. And so I said, why not? I mean, there are some very bright students. Not everybody can do this. And the gentleman from the Rhode Island School, from the Rhode Island Department of Education, at this point said, well, you know, the reason why I did this is because I played basketball. And at some point, the basketball coach said, come, throw on a suit, find your best suit. And he took us to the Rhode Island State University. And I'm sitting there in the classroom. And for the first time, I'm thinking to myself, shit, I can do this. I understand what they're talking about. If they can do it, I can do it too. And that one day changed his life. He became from basically an inner city kid playing basketball, who knows on the way to what gang, to somebody who went to university and got a really high role and became a scholar and a gentleman and just a wonderful human being. And so we came up with this idea that we've got to get the students from Hope High School out of this venue and get them into Brown University. And not to do it like with a tour, where it's again like the Chinese emperor's palace. So what I did, I taught undergraduates at the time, I said, okay, I want volunteers, one of you to take one of the Hope High School students for one day to every single one of your classes, to the dormitories, to the dinners, to everything else, so just that they see how much fun college life is. And that it's a whole lot more fun than anything they could possibly do if they were working. And we teamed up people with other people like them. So we had some football players that came from the inner city. So the toughest kids from Hope High School that were still bright, we teamed up with our football players. And they took them under the arm, and they went with them and spent a day there. And of course, our education system in the United States is terrible. There's so many things wrong with it, and one day isn't going to make a whole lot of difference in the scheme of things. But for what we could do with relatively modest effort, this was a very efficient way to get a lot of these students very excited. And believing the principal at that time, this really made a big deal of difference to many of these students. I have to say that you would think that this would be easy to pull off, but at the time it was not so easy. These were high school students. They were underage. We had to get their parents' permission. We had to get the school's permission. We had to do half the things surreptitiously because otherwise we would run into all sorts of problems. I ran a center at that time, which was actually about something else. But I co-opted the center's director, Maria Karkovich, who then helped me pull this off. In later years, we got everybody a cell phone so that we could reach them in case something would go wrong. And we were, of course, all in fear of something going wrong. But we pulled it off, and we kept it through all the years that I was there. When I came to UCLA, I wanted to do something similar. And I asked one of my colleagues, how do I get into the LA-US Unified School District system so that I can do something like that? And he says, well, you know, I have this friend called Meyer Luskin, and he's just donated a lot of money to the most inner city school that there is, where like a third of the students are adopted rather than living where they are with their birth parents, and the performance was the worst, and he's given a lot of money, and he cares deeply about helping those kids. And why don't I bring you together with him? And that's how I got to learn my very good friend Meyer, and his wife Rini, and we pulled this off for a while. I don't know where it is at the moment. I was told that we continue it. I can no longer be heavily involved with this because I no longer teach the undergraduates, that you need to take those students and have them spend a day with them. But for me, I couldn't have asked for any bigger reward than for having one of my best friends in this life, Maya and Rini. And it was also a great reward to just have helped so many kids. And that's what it's for me, for my next 20, 30 years. That's what I want to do. Do things that are fun and interesting and help other people. That's it. I can do that. I'll be very happy. I will die a very happy person.